It's the fall of 1982 in Chicago. Jane Byrne had been elected their first female mayor 3 years prior. The fear and trepidation over flying in an aircraft after the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 had mostly subsided. The city was featured prominently in a new popular TV series known as Hill Street Blues, and the metropolitan area population sits at a massive 8 million. Meanwhile, as cold and flu season really began to kick into gear, millions of Americans would rush into pharmacies and drug shops looking for any sort of relief. For many, that relief would come in the form of 325 milligrams of acetaminophen, or as you and I better know it as, Tylenol. Chicago would be no different. It was especially hitting that area pretty hard, and Tylenol sales would be up. That would be until some of the most bizarre, disturbing, mysterious murders I have ever heard about. In the end, 7 people would be dead, and Tylenol would lose hundreds of millions of dollars. This is the story of the Tylenol murders.
Right now, they're telling people which lots of Tylenol are known to have contaminated capsules and checking to see if callers have displayed any symptoms of cyanide poisoning.
Any sodium or potassium cyanide capsule within that bottle will emit sufficient hydrocyanic acid gas to detect that hydrogen cyanide.
Johnson Johnson, the parent company of the firm that manufactures Tylenol, has hired a suburban Northbrook firm, the Intertel Security Company, to investigate the Tylenol deaths.
Our story begins on September 28, 1982. Earlier in the day, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman would be complaining of cold-like symptoms, and to offer her daughter any form of relief, her mother would stop by a local Jewel food store and pick up an extra-strength bottle of Tylenol at 4 p.m. Later that morning, Mary would wake up at around 6 and complain of a worsening runny nose and sore throat. She would ask for a Tylenol, and her parents would give her one at 6:15 a.m. They went back to bed, not knowing that Mary would be dead before noon. A few minutes went by after Mary took the Tylenol before her parents would be woken up by what they thought was a banging heard somewhere in the house. They traced this banging sound over to the bathroom. Once they entered the bathroom, they found Mary, unconscious on the bathroom floor. They immediately rushed her over to the Alexian Brothers Medical Center, but it was of little use. Mary was already suffering from cardiac arrest by the time they got there. At 9:56 a.m., 12-year-old Mary Kellerman would be pronounced dead, only 3 hours and 41 minutes after what her parents thought was a simple cold. I can't even begin to imagine how much grief and trauma her family went through then. I can only hope that they somehow made it through that dark period. But for now, they didn't have time to dwell on that. They needed to know how their daughter died. The doctors initially thought Mary had died from a stroke because that was the closest thing to an explanation they could come to. But they, and more importantly her parents, were very suspicious about that diagnosis. Mary was a perfectly healthy girl. She had no known health conditions. And while adolescent stroke isn't unheard of, if you're under 18, the chances of you getting a stroke is like 11 in 100,000. So very, very rare. And for those unfortunate few, most of them already have pre-existing health conditions. Strokes seem to be a very unlikely cause of death. And for the moment, the doctors, her family, they were at a standstill. But what they didn't know is that about 6 miles to the north, a similar story was already unfolding. But unlike Mary's, it would not end in a single victim. It would end in several. As the summer turned to fall, the Janis household would also begin to feel the classic symptoms of cold season. To relieve his family of their annoyance, 27-year-old Adam Janis would stop by a Jewel food store, potentially the same one visited by Mary Kellerman's family, I'm not too sure, but he would pick up extra-strength Tylenol. He would return home, he would take 2 capsules, and while we don't know what time he took the capsules, we do know that at 2:33, he was on his way to the hospital. Adam would barely last 45 minutes this time, before being pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. Now, a very sudden and horrific death in the family like that has to be unimaginable. It particularly took a toll on Adam's little brother, Stanley, and his wife, Terry. What they didn't know, though, is that within the next 5 hours, they were also about to share Adam's fate. Undoubtedly, because of the pain and stress that came with the loss of his brother, Stanley and his wife would be in a lot of pain. They would have something like a headache, so they would take a Tylenol, not knowing that they were ingesting the same poison that Adam had did just hours ago. Within minutes, they would be rushed over to the same hospital where Adam had died earlier in the day. Over at a place called Central DuPage Hospital, yet another situation was developing. A woman by the name of Mary Reiner had been comatose for about 40 minutes at this point. She took a Tylenol at around 3:30 p.m. and was discovered motionless minutes later. Meanwhile, though, as Mary kept fighting for her life, another life would come to an end. Stanley Janus, who would be pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m., with his wife still fighting for her life. Meanwhile, over at a telephone company called Illinois Bell, Mary McFarland would be having her typical day at work when she would feel those classic fall allergies. She took a Tylenol, and within minutes she would claim she felt dizzy and then collapsed on the floor. Within minutes she was rushed over to Good Samaritan Hospital over in a place called Downers Grove, making yet another victim now fighting for their life. The last person to take a fatal dose of Tylenol that day would be a woman by the name of Paula Prince. She would walk the moonlit Wells Street into a local Walgreens and at 9:16 p.m. would purchase a bottle of Tylenol. She would return to her apartment at around 9:30, take the Tylenol, and she wouldn't be found for another 40 hours. Now, we don't know the exact time of her death, but since she received no medical attention at all, I'm gonna assume it happened before midnight, making her the last person to die on the 29th. However, 3 people were still fighting for their lives. As the 29th of September turned into the 30th of September, over at Good Samaritan Hospital at 3:18 a.m., Mary McFarland would lose her fight and would tragically pass away. Not even 6 hours later, over at Central DuPage Hospital, Mary Reiner would also lose her life. That leads us now with the last survivor, Terry Janus. Terry's struggle for life would last almost 70 hours. However, as you can guess, her story would end just like all the others. At 1:15 p.m. on October 1st, 1982, Terry Janus would be the last person to die from the Tylenol. As you can imagine, throughout all the chaos, doctors were none the wiser as to what was happening. They literally just had patients come in and just die without no rhyme or reason. I can't imagine how terrifying it would be. But as the investigation went on, it would not be the doctors who would put the first pieces together. It would instead be a couple of firefighters. Richard Keyworth was a member of the Elk Grove Fire Station. On the morning of September 29th, he was actually on vacation, but he still went to the station every day to collect his mail. While he went there, he overheard the radio, the fire station radio, talk about a truly tragic case. They were talking about the death of Mary Kellerman. Now, since Richard was away from the radio and not the person manning it, he only caught a couple of brief details. He figured out that the kid's name was Mary and that she had died of what doctors thought was a stroke. Now, if you remember earlier, a child having a stroke is a very, very rare occurrence, so Richard thought it was very bizarre. And his suspicions would only heighten after he got a call from his friend Phil Capitelli, who was also a firefighter. Phil would tell him a story about a very bizarre death that happened that day. Like Richard, Phil was also a firefighter. He was actually the lieutenant of the Arlington Heights Fire Station. At his home radio, which I should mention, it's pretty typical for firefighters to have a home radio, he would overhear the story of the Januses, and it reminded him a lot of the Mary Kellerman story, which he had also heard earlier today. He knew that Richard was actually in Mary's fire district, so he asked him for a kind of report on what happened to Mary. They both looked over it, and then Richard would say, quote, "This is a wild stab, but maybe it's Tylenol."
The cyanide-laced capsules that killed Paula Prince were purchased from this Walgreens store at Wells and North Avenues. Store management pulled all the Tylenol off the shelves on Thursday, one day after Paula Prince's death.
Around the same time, on September 29th, while Stanley and Terry were still fighting a losing battle for their lives, doctors at the Northwest Community Hospital would still be struggling to find answers. They would then contact the Arlington Heights village nurse, a woman by the name of Helen Jensen. Jensen would first meet up with the Janices. Now, the Janices were being held in quarantine because no one knew what happened to them, and she just walked right on in. She didn't even talk to the doctor. She went right on in and started talking to the Janices. The relatives gave them a breakdown of what happened in the day, and red flags began to raise in her head when she learned that all three of them had taken Tylenol. She would essentially demand that the police take her to the Janice's home, and they complied. Once she got there, she would begin to observe all the mundane consumables throughout the house. A half-eaten pound cake, a used coffee pot, and then she found the Tylenol. Now, her first instinct was to count. There's usually 50 capsules in there, and she found 44. The recommended dosage for an adult human with the extra strength is 2 capsules. I'm sure you can figure out the math from here. So, 3 people have taken Tylenol. 1 is dead, 1 is about to be dead in less than an hour, and the last one only has 36 hours to live. Jensen would tell the officers that it's the Tylenol, and she would keep reiterating there's something in the Tylenol. However, these would fall on deaf ears. She would later state in an interview, quote, "I'm a woman and a nurse. No one's gonna listen to me." Little did she know that it would not take very long for people to realize she was speaking the truth. Let's go back to those 2 firemen for a bit. After Richard Keyworth brought up the Tylenol theory to his friend Phil Capitelli, Phil would get in contact with the Arlington Heights fire station. These were the firefighters who took the Janice call earlier, and they were now being quarantined. The lieutenant of the fire station, a man by the name of Charles Kramer, would receive the Kellerman information and pass it along to the Janice's doctor, a man by the name of Dr. Thomas Kim. Now, Thomas had heard of the Kellerman death earlier in the day, but he didn't know about the Tylenol theory. And once he heard it, things started to click in his head. Dr. Kim would go through the symptoms of the Janices once more, and he came to the conclusion that all 3 of them were suffering from cyanide poisoning, and he immediately suspected the Tylenol. 2 police officers were dispatched to both the Janice and the Kellerman households to investigate the Tylenol bottles that they still had, and to their surprise, they both had the same lot number and the same expiration date. But the biggest discovery was right around the corner. Dr. Kim would keep check on the surviving Janices to make sure they were alive and stuff. They still were, but I can't imagine the pain and grief knowing that 2 of your family members are dead and the last one's pretty much guaranteed to die, and also the fear knowing that you have no idea how they died, and for all you know, you might be next. It's something I truly hope never happens again to anyone. So did Dr. Kim. In what must have felt like a Hail Mary, he would order both the Janice and the Kellerman capsules to be tested. And once they were, they came back positive for cyanide. They had just found their answer. Now that cyanide poisoning had been confirmed, we can go ahead and talk about the actual details of what happened to these people. I should warn you that the following content ahead might be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. If you want an idea for just how brutal cyanide could be, look at something like Jonestown. 900 people dead in just a matter of hours. It's also the basis for gases like Zyklon B, which of course was used in places like Auschwitz. It is extremely brutal. So what exactly happens if someone takes cyanide? Well, the main problem is that you would not be able to produce any more ATP. Now, ATP is a form of energy within every single one of our cells, and it helps us perform many vital functions in order to keep us alive. You always have a backup supply of it within you, but that depletes fast. And once it's gone, cells will begin to die off and the following symptoms will begin. As the cells in your muscles break down, you're going to begin to feel weaker and weaker. As the poison rips through your stomach, you're going to begin feeling nausea. Your mind will start to slip. You'll start having confusion, headaches, and eventually it's going to start breaking down the very nerves that connect your brain to your limbs, meaning you'll start having tremors and eventually full-blown convulsions. Eventually you'll go completely unconscious. Your breathing will start to slow down, or you'll stop breathing entirely. Death usually comes in two ways. One, like I said, asphyxiation, and two, which is the more likely option, cardiac arrest. The only positive is that this typically doesn't last days or hours. It usually only takes minutes, meaning you probably won't be suffering for very long. And if it does take a long time, like Terry Janice for example, you'll probably be in a state of comatose. If you somehow manage to survive the poisonings, you're going to have a lot of issues in the long run, like brain damage, heart damage, which is going to lead to stuff like heart attacks, dementia even. And according to the Michigan's Office of Environmental Health, you can have Parkinson's disease-like symptoms for weeks after the poisoning. This is exactly what would happen to those 7 individuals in the fall of 1982. And obviously, since these deaths are so publicized, a lot of eyes were now going to be on the company who supplied the pills, Tylenol. They needed to come up with a solution, and they needed to come up with one fast.
Their legal counsel, and from what I heard, the FBI as well, said maybe you shouldn't recall this product when that came up as a discussion point, because this will look like some crazy person can bring a major corporation to its knees. So James Burke, who was then the CEO, in consultation with his top executives, did in fact.
As you can imagine, this was a complete public relations nightmare for not only Tylenol, but also its parent company, Johnson & Johnson. They needed to come up with a good response fast, or it would be the end of their company. We can take a look at previous public relations disasters, or technically future public disasters, with things like the BP oil spill, and more specifically, the response of its CEO, Tony Hayward, after one of his oil raids killed 11 people and God knows how much damage to the environment afterwards. Now, what did Tony say about the situation? Well, he said, quote, "No one wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back." Wow. Just wow, you suck. God, you suck. BP shares would fall by over 30% and would do permanent damage to the company. And if Tylenol weren't careful, they would face the exact same fate. 31 million bottles would end up being recalled from stores all over the country. Initially, this just started in Chicago, but would eventually be the whole nation. The CEO, a man by the name of James Burke, would form a 7-man team to figure out how to A, save as many lives as possible, and B, how to save the company. Media such as television and radio would air broadcasts telling people, do not take Tylenol. As a matter of fact, they would stop producing Tylenol altogether for a few weeks as they figured out what happened. There was a 1-800 number and a separate free toll line where people could just call and get the latest from Tylenol on the situation. They would also hold multiple press conferences as well, but I'm going to get into those a little later once we get into the aftermath section of this video. But for now, how did the public take the response? Well, obviously, immediately after, Tylenol shares would tank. That's just a certainty. But in the years following, they would actually double their market share, and this is mostly due to how positively received their campaign was. Tylenol was a big success during this time, funny enough. However, while Johnson & Johnson were doing the best to keep their company afloat, for law enforcement there was only one question on their minds. who the hell would do something like this, and how did they do it? They started off by examining the tainted bottles, and they noticed something pretty interesting. The bottles were manufactured in 2 different states, those states being Pennsylvania and Texas. This implies one of 2 things. Either A, this was a national operation with multiple people poisoning many bottles at multiple plants, or B, that they were being tampered with once they were actually on store shelves. Option A was already a stretch to say the least and would essentially be proven as impossible once law enforcement realized that all the tainted bottles were coming from the Chicago area. And so they went with option B. So we now have a much smaller area to work with, but still over 7 million people. Any of them could be the suspect. However, it wouldn't take long for this particular suspect to emerge, but instead of the investigators finding the suspect would find the investigators.
As you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since cyanide is inside the gelatin, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I've spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account number 844-9597 at Continental Illinois Bank, Chicago, Illinois. And don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this letter. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do.
Obviously, they weren't going to negotiate with terrorists, so they sent the letter to the FBI, who would trace the bank account back to a man named Richard Richardson. At least that was the name given to the suspect at the time. Once he was apprehended, his true identity would come to light. It was a man by the name of James W. Lewis. Lewis was born on the 8th of August, 1946, and to say he had a tumultuous childhood would be an understatement to say the least. For one, his parents were not the most qualified to raise a child. In fact, federal court documents would state, quote, that they were poor and irresponsible. Eventually, Lewis's father would grow tired of this new life, and he essentially would go out for smoking cigarettes and abandon his family, now leaving only his mother, who would also abandon Lewis, shortly after his 2nd birthday, as a matter of fact. Social workers would find him in a motel where he had, quote, been there for days. In 1949, he was adopted into a foster family where his behavior would begin to take a turn for the worst. In 1966, he would attack his mother with an axe. For this, he was sent to a mental institution for 2 years until 1968. Once he got out, he went to Kansas City and became a tax preparer. This was not the only huge change in James's life, however. He would get married to a woman named Leanne, and they would have a daughter named Toni. Toni would later be diagnosed with Down syndrome, but tragically, when she was just 5 years old, she would pass away from a congenital heart defect. Lewis would blame poorly made heart sutures on the death of his daughter. He would also blame the company who made the sutures, the company in question being Johnson & Johnson, giving what many people believe to be the motive for poisoning the Tylenol all those years later. Lewis would continue his tax work for 4 more years until one of his clients ended up getting murdered. 72-year-old Raymond West had been declared missing for several days, up until the 25th of July, 1978, when police searched his house and they found him dismembered within his own attic. Quickly, they had a suspect, the suspect being James Lewis. For one, they found the rope that was used to bind him in Lewis's car. They also found a handwritten note saying that conveniently, "Oh, I'm about to go on vacation," but it wasn't written by Raymond West. It was written by James Lewis. And the same day they found him, someone tried to forge a check in Raymond West's name. Who forged the check, you might have asked? Well, James Lewis. Now, James's conviction and most likely execution seemed imminent. However, there was a slight problem. He was never read his Miranda rights. His two attorneys, Albert Riederer and Russell Millen, argued that since he was never read his rights during the arrest, that none of the evidence could be used. The judge agreed, and James walked free for the next 4 years until the murders which shocked the world, where he was once again the #1 suspect. Lewis would be arrested on December 13th, 1982. However, he wouldn't be found in Chicago. He would instead be found in New York City, and it seemed that him and his wife had recently fled Chicago because the two were using aliases. Now, he admitted to writing the letter pretty fast, which means that law enforcement were going to be able to pin the murders on him pretty easily. However, he would vehemently deny any and all involvement in the murder, stating that he only wrote the letter to embarrass his wife's former employer. James's wife, Leanne, worked at a travel agency known as Lakeside Travels. From what we know, she did not enjoy her time there at all. When James sent the letter, it had, funny enough, the stamp that Lakeside Travel used, giving some sort of credence to the idea that he did it just to embarrass the company. However, I could believe that more if his story hasn't changed so many times. Throughout the years, decades, throughout many interviews, he's given multiple reasons as to why he's written the letter. Sometimes he says it's for money, or maybe it was an emotional outburst. Despite the obvious red flags and Lewis's history of violence, he would never be actually charged for the murders. He would instead be convicted of fraud. He would be imprisoned in June of 1984, and he would get out in October of 1995. Somehow, this is not the end of Lewis's legal troubles. In the early 2000s, an unnamed woman in her 20s, and quick warning, this is disturbing, would accuse Lewis of something absolutely horrific. She would accuse him of kidnapping, drugging, and sexually assaulting her. Now, when the time came for the woman to testify, she decided not to for one reason or another, and because the prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him, he would once again walk free. James would maintain his innocence for the next 14 years, willingly giving out interviews left and right. In 2023, he would do an interview for that Netflix documentary, I think it's called Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders. It dropped last May, and in the documentary, he would state, once again, that he was innocent. I haven't seen the documentary, just for the record, because I'm not paying $8 a month for a low-quality streaming service with ads, but when the documentary dropped in May, a lot of eyes were on Lewis once again. However, this time, Lewis was not around to see what the world thought of him. On July 9th, 2023, Leanne, his wife of many years, would find him unresponsive on the floor. She would call emergency services, but it was too late. He would be pronounced dead at the age of 76 from liver and heart problems. That concludes the story of James W. Lewis. There's one more thing I want to mention. This photo right here. This is Paula Prince buying the bottle of Tylenol that would take her life. But I want you to take a look at the man in the background. Some people say it's none other than James W. Lewis. I'm going to put two pictures of them side by side, so take a look, make up your own mind about it. However, even though James is usually considered the main suspect, he isn't the only suspect. Roger Arnold was a 48-year-old dock worker who, during the time of the murders, had been saying some pretty suspicious stuff. The owner of a bar he frequented, a man by the name of Marty Claire, would report Roger to the police after he kept talking about stuff like, killing people with a white powder. Now, Roger was not in the best place mentally. He just went through a nasty divorce with his wife, and his behavior was described as erratic. And here's another interesting little factoid. He had a connection to one of the victims. Remember Mary Reiner, who we talked about earlier? Apparently, Roger worked with her father at a warehouse. I couldn't find anything about their relationship or how they got along, but still a pretty creepy fact. So, police would get a search warrant to search Roger's home, and what they found was pretty concerning. Roger owned a book titled, quote, The Poor Man's James Bond, written by a man named Kurt Saxon. Now, Kurt is a interesting man. Throughout the 50s and 60s, he was a member of nefarious groups like the American Nazi Party. He encouraged citizens to build bombs to, quote, wipe out leftists, and he added that student demonstrators should be, quote, machine gunned down in the streets. Mind you, this wasn't even 3 months after the Kent State shootings. Kurt's a very interesting man, to say the least. I might make a whole video about him later down the line. But for now, I want to talk about what's in the Poor Man's James Bond book. Now, the book came into discussion because it had instructions on how to make potassium cyanide, which of course is the same cyanide used in the murders. That wasn't the only strange thing Roger owned. He had the Anarchist Cookbook and also a one-way ticket to Thailand for some reason. Roger was questioned numerous times by police, but due to a lack of evidence, he was never charged. However, he would not remain free for long. This investigation undoubtedly did even more damage to his already failing mental health. In April of 1983, he would purchase a .45 caliber pistol to protect himself from vigilantes, as he put it. However, his real motive was far more sinister. Roger would hold a grudge against one man in particular, Marty Sinclair, the bar owner who originally reported Roger to the police. He would walk the streets of Chicago at night trying to hunt for Marty, but never be successful, only making him more agitated. In short, Roger was a ticking time bomb, and that time bomb would go off on June the 7th, 1983. That day, Roger was drinking at a bar called Lily's with the pistol in his pocket. Around 10 p.m., someone reportedly told him, quote, "Watch out, Marty Sinclair is in here." He initially decided to remove himself from the situation. He went over to a Mexican restaurant where he realized that his cigarette lighter was still at the bar. He decided to go back until he saw someone who he was certain was none other than Marty Sinclair. Roger would call out to his supposed snitch saying, "Marty, did you turn me in?" Before the man had a chance to react, Roger would pull his pistol and shoot the man a single time in the chest. This is when Roger realized that the man he shot was not Marty Sinclair. It was a man by the name of Johnson Tylenol. He was a 46-year-old computer programmer, a husband, and a father. He has been described as a very loving husband, a great father, and a reliable friend. Roger would initially flee the scene of the crime and try to dispose of evidence. However, at the advice of his lawyer, he would turn himself into police the very next day. After a 7-month trial, Roger would be found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He would only serve 15 of those years due to parole laws. After which, he continued to deny his involvement in the poisonings. However, he would frequently admit to the killing of Stanisha, and he would repeatedly express remorse. He would pass away on June the 16th, 2008. Now, of these two suspects, which one do I think did it? Let me emphasize, I'm not an expert, I'm not a lawyer or any of that, and also because these two people still have living relatives, I'm not formally accusing any one of them of being guilty. This is just my opinion, and if you disagree, please tell me why in the comments. But yeah, to begin with, I do not think Roger was the one behind the killings. Now, as we saw, he certainly has the capability of killing someone, but if you look at what happened to him after, he really didn't come out of this mentally happy with what he'd done. A couple months before his release in 1996, he would state, quote,
"I killed a man, a perfectly innocent man. I had choices. I could have walked away."
If you were someone who, before this, murdered 7 people, one of them being a 12-year-old girl, wouldn't you still feel remorse over this? I mean, hey, he felt remorse over Stanisha's murder. And also, we have the confessions that he gave to police. We have him literally turning himself in. Why wouldn't he do that after the Tylenol killings? And after the Tylenol killings, they required such a precise operation, yet his killing of Stanisha, who, remember, he thought was a bar owner, why was it so sloppy? While Roger is still considered a person of interest, in the minds of most, there was only ever one suspect: James Lewis. His red flags are obvious: the extortion letter, his violent past, his possible involvement at least, with another murder, his possible involvement with kidnapping and assaulting a woman. And also, people note that he is a very manipulative man. He has changed his stories so many times on his extortion letter and his anger towards Johnson & Johnson, among many others. However, there is one slight problem I should mention. In 2010, the FBI asked for DNA samples of James Lewis and Ted Kaczynski for some reason. No, I'm not joking. And they compared James's DNA to the DNA found on one of the bottles. It was not a match. And while this doesn't absolve James, it certainly adds yet another layer of fog to this mystery. It's for reasons like that I can't say for 100% certainty that James did it. Now, I certainly have my suspicions, and honestly, I personally think it was James who did it. However, I can't say I'm 100% sure. Now that James and Roger are both dead, we might never have a definitive answer to what their involvement in this case truly was, and who truly committed these murders. However, even though the true perpetrator was never unmasked, we still feel the immediate aftermath of the actions to this very day. For the last portion of this video, I just want to talk about some of the more bizarre developments that have happened to this case in the last few years.
Now to the latest in painkiller, the Tylenol murders. We may never know what really happened after the death of a key suspect. James Lewis has died. Back in 1982, he was believed to be a prime suspect.
Now, we already know how Johnson & Johnson would fare in the immediate aftermath, but what about later down the line? How would they prevent something like this from ever happening again? Well, they introduced a safety seal, essentially right below the cap, that would essentially make it impossible to tamper with the packaging. And over the years, pretty much all other pharmaceutical companies have followed suit. The following year, in 1983, there would be the passing of the Tylenol bill, essentially making it a federal crime to tamper with medicine products. If you were caught doing that, you'd face 20 years in prison, and if someone died as a result of this tampering, you'd be in jail for the rest of your life. Finally, and probably the scariest part of the segment, let's talk about some of the copycat attacks that happened. In 1986, 3 people would die after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol. The same year, a woman named Diane Ellsworth would also die after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol. No arrests were ever made in her case. There were also many other murders and even a suicide. However, none of these poisonings have ever reached a death toll as high as the original Tylenol killings. And with that, we have reached the end of the story of the Tylenol murders. One of the most dark and disturbing cases of all time. But it's a story I believe needs to be told. It's terrifying, but it's also fascinating. And it reminds us, hey, maybe check the seal of your medicine next time. Might just save your life. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am so sorry for how long this video took to get out. Peace.